Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Horacio de la Iglesias, a professor of biology at the University of Washington and one of the leading voices in applying circadian science to the real world. His lab's research spans the molecular mechanisms of applying biological clocks and their molecular mechanisms to understanding their societal implications. For example, how light exposure affects sleep patterns and how school schedules impact adolescence. He has not only published widely on the neuroscience of circadian rhythms, but he has also worked with school districts and policymakers to advocate for sleep-informed education reform. My first question, what actually is a circadian rhythm and why does it matter beyond sleep?
Hi, Sanjay. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Well, a circadian rhythm is a cycle, a rhythm, as its name indicates, that has roughly 24 hours, and it can be in any of your biological functions, including behavior, physiology, biochemistry, and overt behavioral outputs like mood and other traits. And we call them circadian because they have a period that is close to 24 hours. However, under natural conditions, these rhythms are synchronized or entrained by 24-hour cycles in the environment. So they are in sync with the environment, and that makes them highly adaptive. The best example that we can relate to is the sleep-wake cycle. The sleep-wake cycle is probably the most prominent circadian rhythm that alternates our state of mind between an unconscious and a conscious state of mind. And that's governed by the circadian system. So that in itself is a circadian rhythm.
Yeah. So what first drew you to circadian biology and how did your research evolve toward adolescent sleep?
So, what drew me to circadian biology was research that I did as an undergraduate in Argentina. I was studying crabs that live in the intertidal zone, and those crabs have not only circadian rhythms like we do, but also rhythms that are synchronized by tides because
Oh,
they have these two prominent cycles that they're exposed to,
yeah.
the light dark cycle, the 24-hour day, as well as the tidal cycle that can have different nuances in its um, rhythmicity. And that, as I studied behavior in crabs, that brought me into contact with the fact that all their behavior and physiology was organized according to these two cycles. And that drew my interest to biological clocks, which then brought me to the US to do my PhD in mammals. And that's how I continue my study in animal models of circadian rhythms. Eventually started studying sleep in animal models as well. And then an opportunity came about to study indigenous communities in Argentina that back then did not have exposure to electricity. And they represented a very unique opportunity to study rhythms without the influence of electric light that we know has had a major impact on how we sleep. So that brought me to my first human sleep project, and that got me interested in that field. And then the second study that I did was related to high school students here in Seattle.
Yeah.
Um, so as I was doing this work with indigenous communities. My kids were in school back then, and one evening I went to give a talk to my um, daughter's high school on biological clocks and rhythms, and talked about the influence of biological clocks on sleep. You started asking me why are circadian rhythms important? Well,
Yeah.
it turns out that circadian rhythms help us anticipate the changes in the day, right? You could wait for the sun to come up and wake up in response to the sun, but it's actually much more convenient
Yeah.
and adaptive and physiologically meaningful if you actually get prepared before the sun comes up. And the way to do that is to have an internal clock, an internal timing mechanism that can predict that in an hour or so, the sun will come up, and then you're ready to go with all your physiology, hormones, alertness to start with your morning. So when I gave this talk at the high school, I talked about the incompatibility between the teenagers' circadian clock and school start times that are too early, which is a problem throughout the US.
Yeah.
And then after that, a teacher in the school, a science teacher, contacted me to see whether I would be willing to be part of a grassroots movement to try to change the school start time in Seattle. And that got me into my second human project, which was back then, um, how high school students sleep and how the school start time impacts them. Turns out that after about 4 to 5 years of lobbying, talking to superintendents, school boards, students, parents, um, principals in different schools, eventually we convinced the Seattle School Board to change the school start time by about an hour. School started at 7:50, and suddenly they decided to start them at 8:45. And we were really amazed because although I was the sleep expert in this group of people that included teachers, parents, some students, and myself.
Right.
Um, and the science was very solid on the fact that the teenage clock is delayed relative to younger
Yeah.
kids or older adults or younger adults. Um, Actually, more middle-aged to older adults. Um, but um, but we were really surprised that eventually they said, well, we take the what you're telling us at face value, and we'll go ahead and change the schedule. Um, so that actually created an opportunity for our lab to study the impact
Yeah.
of that change in our local community. And back then, I had a grad student that was doing another project studying sleeping undergraduates. And I told him, well, I think this is a unique historical opportunity that we have in Seattle. We should switch and start studying high schoolers. And we did. So we did a first study before the school start change because we have very little time. And then right after it changed, we repeated the study a year later in the same season to make things as closely match as we could. And we saw a dramatic change in their sleep, and that kind of became, in a way, a poster child example
Yeah.
of how school start time impacts sleep in students.
Yeah. That's actually how I heard about you through the study, and that's why I reached out to you because I was so impressed with like the results of the study and the fact that you guys were able to get an increase in sleep and push back the times. So related to that though, a lot of people lobby and try to push back school start times, but there's lots of issues with after school activities, transportation, right? So what has been the single most or the single biggest obstacle in getting that change and getting the school to really pushing back their time? And what do you think overall is the number one factor that's stopping schools from pushing back times, especially in high school?
Okay, so I'll start by um, telling you how Seattle did this. So
Okay.
after they made a decision, they created a task force that was charged with researching what would be the impact in each one of the stakeholders associated with the school system. And this took about a year, right? A little bit less, maybe 6 months of meeting weekly, weekly or every other week. And I was part of that task force. And in these meetings, we met with people that run pre and after school care,
Okay.
people that run dining halls in the schools, people that the people in charge of the metro transportation system in Seattle, the people charged with the school transportation in Seattle, sports coaches, teachers, um, nurses in school. So each week we'd meet with one and we said, okay, what would be the impact if we delay 1 hour the school start time? And most of them, we also went to community centers, different groups went to community centers to assess how this will impact individual families in different neighborhoods with different socioeconomic um, structure. Um, and it turned out that in most cases, most of the preconceptions we had about the impact of delaying the school start time were completely wrong. Um, and it's interesting because you said, what is the main factor that keeps school districts from delaying school start time?
Yeah.
I think it's a prejudice against a delayed start time.
Right.
And when people have a very strong prejudice about something, they start creating their own evidence of things that are not true. I mean, this is
Yeah.
kind of it's kind of interesting because I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
We ask people, how do you think this will impact families? And they would say, well, this will impact lower income families because the high schoolers in the family typically pick up the kids, the younger kids
Yeah.
at school in lower grades in primary school.
Right.
So if primary, because in order to make the change, primary schools had to start early and high schools later. We have to
Yeah.
swap
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Um, Turns out that when we went to community centers and we asked people, is this true? Everybody said, no, that's not true. For some families, it was true. For other families, they actually needed help in the morning, not in the afternoon. So that was one example that when we did the research, it was clearly a preconception
Yeah.
that didn't hold with data. The same was true for the metro system, for pre and after school care. And there were two sticking issues that were really relevant. The first one is that in order to enact this change, we had to swap many of the elementary schools to start early in the morning. Some of the elementary schools started at 9 a.m., which didn't make any sense
Yeah.
because young kids are awake at 7 a.m.
Right.
spontaneously.
Yeah.
Um, so the problem with sending all the elementary schools to the early morning is that we needed more buses to bus them to school. Buses in high school are not a problem because high schoolers don't get bus unless
Right.
they
Yeah.
have disability in at least in Seattle. I don't know how it works in our states, in other states. So what turned out to be the case was that the school district had to buy some new buses, but this ended up being a relatively minor investment in the overall picture of things.
Right.
The second sticking point were, and this is still an issue, were sports coaches.
Yeah.
Sport coaches use the after school time for training. And
Yeah.
the problem in Seattle is that it's very overcast and very northern latitude. So basically, in the winter after 4 p.m., you have no natural
Oh.
light to the
Yeah.
sport. So they complained bitterly about this. And that I think was the only group that remained dissatisfied with the change. And in
Okay.
fact, some football coaches
Yeah.
in the schools that we studied switched their training to 5 a.m. in the morning, something like that, which completely defeats the purpose of a school change. But
Yeah.
um, so anyway, So I guess that's a very long answer to your question.
Yeah,
But essentially, I think it's really important to bring to the table every single stakeholder before you enact a change like this.
yeah,
First of all, because I think it's really important to hear their voices.
yeah, yeah,
And second is when we did, it was very clear that a lot of the things that people were predicting would happen, would not happen.
yeah,
When we looked at the data, when we
yeah,
talked to them, they said, no, that's not true. It's not going to impact us in that way.
yeah,
Um, so I guess but other than that, I think the benefits completely outweigh the costs
yeah.
um, of the change.
Have you seen it translate to any other schools, maybe near Seattle or just across the US yet?
Only some schools near the Seattle School District and the whole state of California. In fact,
Okay.
the California was the first state to pass a statewide um, law that does not allow middle and high schools to start before 8:30. And that was to a great extent inspired by our study. In fact, I had to write a couple of letters to legislators
Wow.
in California when they were trying to push this bill. And then more recently, Florida also passed a law like that.
Okay.
Um, and so yeah, I think it's very slow.
Right.
There's still a lot of pushback,
Yeah.
but I think eventually this should at least happen.
Do you think, if you had to take a guess, do you think within the next 5 to 10 years you would see the change start to happen more rapidly, or do you think it would still continue to be very slow? What do you think?
I think it's going to be very slow. People are
Okay.
extremely reluctant. There's sort of a sacrosanct sort of
Yeah.
belief that high
Yeah.
schoolers have to start early school.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense,
Yeah.
but we're still doing this to the vast majority of our high school students in the US.
Yeah.
Um, Even when it is clear that it results in poor sleep, poor performance,
Yeah.
poor sports performance, all kinds of adverse health, physical and health and mental health outcomes.
Yeah. So, for context, my high school starts at 7:30 a.m. and a lot of high schools here start around the same time. What would you
Mhm.
say is the minimum amount of time you'd have to push back the start time to start to see the benefits? Or does even like a very small amount of time
I
start?
think at least an hour.
Okay.
I think ideally you'd have to start at 9, but that's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Sorry.
so 8:30 should be a good time. And the main reason is that in our case, when we delayed the school start time by 1 hour, the students gained 35 minutes of sleep.
Yeah.
They didn't gain an hour, which means that they go to bed probably a little bit later, although
Yeah.
that was not statistically significant. Um, but they're waking up about 50 minutes later, right? So
Okay.
when you add up the numbers, this results in 35 more minutes of sleep. And by the way, they're still sleep deprived, but they're less sleep deprived than the kids in St. Louis.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry to
True.
break it to you.
Yeah, that's probably true. So, if we fail to address this over the next couple of years, do you think there are any long-term consequences that we'll start to see, or what does your research say mostly?
Well, the long-term consequences are already here. You know,
Okay.
the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder or attention for deficit hyperactivity disorder has been increasing and continues to increase. And sleep experts, and I'm included among them, believe that many of these diagnostics are just chronically sleep deprived kids. I invite you and all the viewers of your podcast to
Yeah.
go to the webpage and put symptoms of HDHD and symptoms of chronic sleep deprivation, and they will match one by one up to 80%. Okay.
Wow.
And what do we do to these kids? We give them amphetamines because that's what you take if you have
Yeah.
ADHD or well, amphetamines is the worst thing you could take if you have problems sleeping, right?
Uh,
Um, because they inhibit sleep.
yeah.
So,
They're stimulants,
of
right?
course, what's that?
Are they stimulants? Are they classified as stimulants?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
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 So, I think the consequences are already here, and of course, they are becoming worse with the arrival of evening screens, right? We now have cell phones that provide
Yeah.
information and light until very late in the evening, and teenagers are particularly prone to use screens in the
Yeah.
evening, and this has made this sleep deprivation crisis even worse. So now we have a combination, which is a schedule that forces students to wake up at a time that is very unnatural to
Yeah.
them. For me to ask you to wake up at 6:30 to go to school, okay, it's equivalent for you to ask me to wake
4:30.
up 4:30.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. I was just gonna finish your sentence. 4:30. The 2 hour delay, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
essentially, teenagers have a 2 hour delay,
Yeah.
essentially, relative to an adult. And so essentially, if I were asked to wake up at 4:30 every single day, I don't feel very well at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Within 2 weeks, I'd be completely dysfunctional.
Right.
Well, we're doing this to every single or to the vast majority of
Yeah.
high schoolers in the country.
Yeah.
On top of that, now they have a drive to stay awake much later than they did, right? Because they can take their cell phone to
Yeah.
bed, interact with it. That's not only a source of light, which light in the evening is very bad. Well, it's not bad, it is what it is. It delays your circadian system. So now that sleep has shortened even more.
Yeah.
Um, and there are many economists that have calculated the long-term losses that you can
Oh,
predict
yeah.
by losing 2 hours of sleep per day for your whole teenage years. And
Yeah.
they're quite dramatic numbers. Um, Essentially, most teenagers in the US are sleeping 2 hours less than what sleep doctors recommend they should be
Yeah.
sleeping.
Outside of schools, what other parts of society would you say are still misaligned with our biological clocks?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that um, there are two issues that relate to that question. The
Oh,
first one is that it turns out that there's a huge variability in what we call chronotype.
yeah.
Chronotype is what is your natural preference for the optimal activity and performance, right?
Yeah.
Some of us are many very morning persons, and some of us are very evening persons, right?
Yeah.
It turns out that our society, um, probably because we come from agricultural ancestors, is designed for very early people, right? Um, but that's not great for people that are very late owls,
Yeah.
right? That are natural late owls.
Yeah.
So, in a way, this impacts every single job out there, right? Because depending on what type you are, you may have a preference of morning or evening, but if your job doesn't allow you to choose your own schedule, that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's not written on stone, right? So in other words, you can change your chronotype, but it's very hard if you're a naturally, uh, as we call them, late owl. It will be very hard to shift your system to an earlier time. So that's the first thing. So this impacts every job, and I think in general, society should try to make work schedules more flexible so people can fit to their own internal timing.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's being progressively done, particularly now after. COVID
Yeah.
that remote work has become more common, people can actually do that much better.
Yeah.
Um, the second thing is we have practices that chronically misalign people. Um, and for instance, daylight savings time,
Oh yeah.
that's a very bad practice
Yeah.
that puts your internal time out of synchrony with the social time.
Yeah.
Basically, your internal time is what your biological clock tells your brain and your liver and your muscles when you should be active and when you should not. Okay.
Yeah.
Your social time is where your society tells you, well, you have to be at school at 7:30. Sorry, if your biological clock tells you that you should be here at 9:30, it's your problem, right? You still have to be there. Um, so that creates a misalignment, and the way in which we measure that misalignment is with the metric that we call social jet lag. And the measurement that we use for that social jet lag is the difference in sleep timing between your weekend and between your work or school days. The bigger that difference, the more misaligned you are. Because what's happening is that during the weekends, you typically default to your internal time. So if you go to bed later on the weekend and wake up later on the weekend, it's not, that you just like to do that. It's actually your internal timing that is pushing your sleep to a later time on the weekend. So daylight savings time, it's a great example of a practice that is very bad for our circadian system, and that it um, it will always lead to an internal misalignment. Second thing, there are many time zones that are very misaligned with solar time,
Okay.
and this is very classically true in Europe, for instance. If you think about it, the time in Western Spain is the exact same social time as in Berlin, which are 2 hours apart in
Oh,
time zone. Okay.
yeah.
Well, um, this makes the Spaniards very late, right? Because they are synchronized with the solar day, right? And so are the Berliners. Um, but for the Berliners, it makes sense to wake up at 7 a.m. to go to work. For the Spaniards, it doesn't. Because 7 a.m., it's actually the middle of the night for them. Okay.
Yeah.
Just you do the math. And in fact, Spaniards are known for having dinner very, very late, right? Um, Turns out that if you calculate that in solar time, they have dinner at the same time as Berliners at 7 p.m. solar
Interesting.
time, right? Or roughly. So, um, so anyway, so that's another time zones have been drawn um, artificially, and in most cases they're drawn for political reasons, right? I mean, all Europe wants to be in the same times at the same time for business purposes, right?
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily good um, for people. There are other practices that are now um, drawing more attention. For instance, street lighting is one
Oh,
that has received a lot of attention, and even lighting within your job or schools. Turns out that our circadian system, our biological clocks respond differently to light at different times of the day, and they also respond differently to different wavelengths of light. So blue light is not the same as um, warmer lights, right? And therefore you can, particularly now that LED lighting is so inexpensive, you can design not only your workplace lighting with a schedule, but you can also design your home lighting depending on what time you're going to be at home, as well as the street lighting, so it doesn't interfere as much as with our biological clocks.
yeah. So based on your work, if you could change one thing about the University of Washington's campus to align better with circadian rhythms, what would it be?
Well, abolish daylight savings time,
Okay. Yeah. That's
which
fair.
is little bit bigger than I've been lobbying for that in the state and in
Okay.
the federal government. But there's a lot of pushback against that
Yeah.
because particularly the restaurant business and all the
Oh,
businesses that do business in the evening want that extra hour of light.
yeah.
Um, then I would not allow any class to start before 8:30,
Okay.
and I try to make flexible class schedules. That's
Yeah.
very hard in a university campus that has
Right.
4,000 students, right? But the general idea is that students should be taught, learn, and then allow to um, detect what their best timing of
Yeah.
activity is, and then be able to have their classes at those times. Um, and then I think I'd also implement wide um, sleep health education. I think that most teenagers and young adults don't know the importance of sleep and the benefits
Yeah.
of good sleep.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. My mentor in the first interview, he said the same thing about flexible class schedules. He saw
Mhm.
almost, I think, maybe 400% increase in enrollment when he changed his class from, I think, around 7 in the morning to 4 in the
Yeah,
evening.
that makes sense.
And it's kind of ironic because his class was about circadian rhythms. I think he was
Yeah.
teaching people at WashU about it. So he told me that story and I was shocked. But it makes sense, I guess, when you really think about it. Um,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So, looking ahead, what excites you the most about research on circadian rhythms, and where do you think the field's going in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, I think what excites me the most at this moment is that um, even when we've evolved and also historically moved into um, living in conditions that are extremely isolating from the natural environment. So we now live in these amazingly built environments that isolate us from the sun, from the moon, from many other factors. And we think that we are sort of immune to those factors, right? So most of us think, well, if I keep the lights on whenever I'm working, who cares about what the sun is doing out there? Who cares about what the moon is doing out there? Well, it turns out that those major um, environmental cycles are still governing our circadian system.
Yeah,
And we have not only work showing that the solar day is probably the most important factor determining your sleep timing, at least if you're an undergraduate student living in Seattle, but also that the moon can modulate your circadian rhythms, your sleep, even when you're living in a place with high light pollution like Seattle and where you think or you're totally unaware of what the moon is doing. Well, it turns out that your sleep physiology is still modulated by those factors. So that to me is kind of fascinating because it shows me that we are still animals, even when we think
yeah,
that we've dominated nature to some extent. Um, and then I think that a great part of the field will evolve into incorporating our knowledge of circadian biology, of the neurobiology of biological clocks into our daily lives,
yeah,
right? And our high school schedule studies, just one example of that. But if you
yeah,
think about it, we live in cities that have a lot of um, environmental challenges to our circadian system. Not only the work time the time that you need to be at work, but also the commuting time, um, whether you have light at night, whether you don't have enough light during the day, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all factors that are shaping our health and well-being. And I think progressively we will learn to, um, in a way, leverage our circadian system, not just at the as the single person level, but also at the community level to better our lives.
Yeah. It's really exciting to hear. So that will wrap up our episode on neurocracy. Thank you so much for making the time and speaking with me. Your insights are very helpful, and I'll be trying to apply them in my local community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay, and anytime.
Okay.